All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Lincoln University. Welcome to our flagship Waimaria building, and welcome to the Excellence series. Today we will be hearing from, looking at the crowd, one of the favorites, and but I won't go into that detail. I'll leave it up to the Vice Chancellor. My name is Wim de Koning. I will do some health and safety, and then I will introduce Professor Grant Edwards, our Vice Chancellor, who will then be the master of ceremony for the rest of the afternoon. Emergency exits. We don't expect any fire drills today, so if we hear the alarm, it is the real deal. We have emergency exits on the back, and that actually, that green piece of grass that we see in front of the Forbes building is also the place where we would actually gather in case of an emergency. If of course the emergency is over there, we will use these doors to actually exit, and you can actually go out that way, but we can also go out this way. There is plenty of Lincoln University staff in the room that will escort the non-Lincoln University staff out to a safe place, so please do not worry. Toilets are just across from where you came in, and afterwards, when Professor Allison is finished with her talk, there is an opportunity for some drinks and nibbles, and we will do that in the cafeteria area, but we will point you in the right direction when we get there. When we actually be in the cafeteria area, you will discover that we will offer you some beverages as well. Please make sure that you come home safe, so please drink responsibly. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to the Vice Chancellor of Lincoln University, Professor Grant Edwards.
And welcome here this evening to the Lincoln University Excellence Series. This is about a series of talks celebrating our academic reputation, particularly of our professorate. Through this series, we aim to engage and contribute to the public debates on many of the critical issues facing our country and our communities, and showcase the impact of our leading research and education of the land-based sectors in particular. This evening, we're going to hear from Professor Alison Bailey, as she shares her research on sustainable farming systems and farmer decision-making. I look forward to this. Her research spans historical perspectives within the broader agri-food ecosystem, encompassing soil, water management, ecosystem services, through to climate and energy management. More recently, as her focus has shifted to examining decision-making themselves and various factors influencing the choices of those decision makers. A little bit about Alison, so we get some context here. Alison's research has been conducted across the European Union, the United Kingdom, and most recently here in New Zealand, in collaboration with governments, commercial and charitable organisations. This collaborative effort has resulted in improvements in implementation of government legislation, reducing administrative burdens for both government bodies and the farming industry. Additionally, her research has sparked new initiatives aimed at simplifying or modifying farm practices. A little bit more about Alison in terms of her role here in the university. Alison is a Professor of Farm Management at Lincoln University and Head of the Department of Land Management and Systems. We welcome Alison and look forward to her presentation. Thank you.
So, implementing farming systems for the future, which way now? Confession to make, I'm not actually going to answer that particular question. I gather we have people here from the ministry. We might even have regional council people here. We might have rural professionals here, academics, and even farmers. And in all of those cases, I am guessing that you frequently, in exasperation, ask the question, which way now? You might not put it as politely as that, but so the purpose of my talk is really to focus on, okay, the which way now, how can we help in that system to directing towards farming systems of the future. So it's really a not which way now, but the process that we go about for that. So what is this talk really about? Who am I and where am I from? I'll do a little bit of background. What is driving the system? The research that I've done, what keeps me amused? Farming perspective, what do our farmers think? And the decision-making context and what next in relation to that. Now, in all of this, including identifying myself, it is my perception about things. There will be people in the room and I will make generalizations, and there will be people in the room going, that doesn't ring true with me. We do try to generalize. I trained as an economist and try to generalize, and there will be not necessarily outliers but differences of opinion. So if you can bear that in mind when I make certain statements. So I'm originally from the UK, and my education was in a place called Wales, and I learnt at the time a fair bit about Welsh dairy farming and Welsh hill sheep and beef systems. I then was an educator in the UK and spent a lot of time talking to students about the common agricultural policy. Now, the perception that our European farmers are subsidised isn't that great is not the case in reality. So yeah, snouts in the trough could be one perception, but the reality, it's not as, I would say, nice as that. So we have a policy, or had a policy, or continue to have a policy, which has incentives, but also has the stick associated with that. So there is legislation and regulation to meet. There was an incentivised system which encouraged production, but it also discouraged certain other things. And there is a danger in New Zealand of a similar process happening. Obviously, the UK has recently exited from the European Union, and there are some changes coming there. So what is driving the system? So in New Zealand, as in any other country, there is a lot of legislation. So New Zealand has the Resource Management Act, and semester 2 coming up, I'm going to be talking to the students about ag systems and sustainability. Last year, I was talking to the students about ag systems and sustainability and the Resource Management Act and the new Natural and Built Environment Act that was coming in. This year, I'll be backtracking to, well, that's not quite going to happen. Hence the frustration, which way now? So, as an academic, I stand there and go to my students, the difficulty of keeping up with all this is it's difficult. I'm an academic. We have the rural professionals that have to do similar. We have the farmers who have to do similar. It gets quite complicated. So we have our regulation. So National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, various iterations, but it's pretty much there. We've got greenhouse gas emissions. When I first arrived in 2016, there was a definite focus on water quality. I said to the students, you'll see stuff coming in about greenhouse gases soon. You'll see some other stuff coming in. So we have the emissions trading scheme, depending on the government of the day, depends whether we're going to put agriculture in or out or what we're going to do. We've had this discussion, Hiwaka Ekinoa. We don't really know. And then we got a National Policy Statement for Biodiversity. And again, we don't really know. But I said to the students at the time, these things will be important. That's all the legislation. Whatever government is in place, that's what's driving the system. For those of you who attended Alan Rennick's professorial address, we use the same slide, so you'll have seen this before. What drives the system is what our customers want, and our customers are those big companies. They feed into our processors then feed to our farming systems about what is needed. So water quality, the greenhouse gases, habitat and biodiversity, whatever government is in, we're still going to need to meet the requirements of those processors. Some of them have some interesting requests based on their assumption of the different types of farming system, which leads to interesting trade negotiations. So what keeps me amused? So where is my research activity? I went to university and decided to become an agricultural economist. My PhD moved more into the environmental economics, so I started valuing the environment, and then I ended up in farm management. And my focus of my research has tended to be in the ag systems and sustainability place, working in multidisciplinary teams. Usually I'm the add-on to the science that's going on, and then they say, Alison, can you cost this for us, and can you tell us whether it's going to work in practice? So I then sort of take into the, well, okay, is it going to be cost effective? Is it going to be viable? Is it going to actually meet the demands of the general public? Plus, are the farmers actually going to be able to innovate, adopt, do this thing sensibly? So that just lists the sort of things I've got involved with over time in terms of funded projects and students I've supervised. And as you can see, a lot of it has ended up in the decision-making adoption stage. And for my own amusement, I went on, I think it's Scholar Goggle or something it is, which creates a word cloud. And I've done a fair lot in the soil space, or published a lot in the soil space. That could be to do with the postdoc that was involved and the main supervisor as well. There is other stuff in there if you look closely. My most cited paper is in regard to pollination. But soil is pretty important to farmers. Pollination is also pretty important in terms of food production. So where are we heading, and what's important? So I've put this quote up. I nicked it from a MB research application that I've put in, so it is my own words, but I think it's important. We have a globalised world. We have agribusinesses that are exposed. Farmers, growers are going to have to address the issues in relation to the big business world, the globalised world that we sit in. And the way in which farmers respond will be dependent on their resilience, but also will influence their resilience. And an important part is going to be new systems, new technologies, and in negotiating through this process, myself as an academic, the rural professionals, the processors, the government, the regional councils, everything, we have to have an understanding of decision making and how that changes over time. So what do our farmers think? And remember, I said this is my perception. So when I first got here, I had a postdoc, Jacob, and we did a study of dairy farmers. So we did a pilot study of dairy farmers, looking at what they thought in relation to the 3 pillars of sustainability. We didn't couch it in the terms of the 3 pillars of sustainability. We ran a series of focus groups to draw out the key things that they thought were important. We did a couple of pilot interviews. We came up with a list of things that they then had to trade off. And one thing we hadn't sort of picked up at the start that came in later was dairy farmers' concern for their employees and the working hours that their employees do, and the number of leave days that their employees have. So yes, they were concerned about the productivity and the resilience of the system in terms of the financial part of sustainability. And I always tell my students, you have to be financially viable as well as the environment bit, and then also as the social bit. And this was around 2017, so water pollution was key on the agenda. Greenhouse gas emissions in that area hadn't really come into the framework of farming systems at that time. Farmers were less concerned generally about their own work-life balance and the working hours they did in taking leave and sort of broader habitat and biodiversity areas. I've also done studies across the whole of Europe, looking at what concerned our European farmers. So here we've got Germany, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Sweden and the UK, looking at what we would call ecosystem services. And the top one generally was soil fertility. Farmers are really concerned about their soil, looking after their soil. And then for some, it was also then the water availability and access to water, and then other things featured in that. For some, such as Poland and Italy, pollination was pretty important. Without pollination, there are certain food crops we can't grow. So there were concerns there. And then I also did a study in relation to cropping farmers in the UK, and I've brought this up in relation to, we did a literature survey of you know, what farmers think about, what drives them, and what their concerns are. And we came up with these sort of 7 main areas. So income, being viable, autonomy, doing things that they wanted to do without interference, having a fun job, so a bit of complexity thrown in there rather than the day-to-day mundane, being able to do a bit of recreational land use, so the game shooting, the hunting, what their farm actually looked like to the outside world, in terms of not having those troublesome weeds that appear above the crop, the ones that were hidden, not so much a problem, having the wildlife there, having the landscape there, and then the time spent farming and not farming, time away from farming. And I've got my bit of paper here because I can never remember numbers, but farmers were asked to trade off essentially the areas circled as representing income and their autonomy, the management complexity, the appearance as an area looking at the wider environment side, and then the time spent farming and the recreational use as the sort of working environment alongside that autonomy. And the weighting went 34% on the income side, 37% on the working environment, and 29% on the environmental management. Now, you could argue that with income side, we've got profit and risk. Working environment, we've got our autonomy, our complexity, the opportunity for recreation and time spent farming, and the environment, we've got our food crops, our wildlife, and our habitat there. So you could argue, well, we've got 4 on the working life, we've got 3 on the environment, and we've got 2 on the income. So would we weight the environment more because there's 4 factors we're considering, but we sort of weighted them accordingly. So our farmers in this UK study, they're weighting the income side, the environment side, and their social work-life balance out almost equally. So we've got a situation where UK study weighting these pillars of sustainability equally, our dairy farmers thinking about looking after their farming staff, but also income is important, and that water quality thing is important because there's a regulated driver there. And the EU study telling us that farmers do actually, in terms of the environment, want to look after their soil. So let's think about the decision-making context, where to from here. So this is a slide I put up for my students. We do a little exercise first, but the idea is that we have scientists who work in individual component areas, and we have scientists who collaborate. Both are very important, but we do need the broad systems approach. So the idea here is that you could have these four blind men encounter the king's elephant. Another story is they're in a dark room and encounter an elephant. I wouldn't be too keen on that particular scenario. Each person feels one part of the elephant only and comes up with a different perspective. So one's got a rope, one's got a rug, one's got a pipe, one's got a pillar. You start putting the things together and you get an elephant. So we have to think big picture, we have to think the whole system, which is why I quite like working in multidisciplinary teams. In terms of the decision-making context, in terms of that multidisciplinary nature, we also have to think about the different parts that need to come together. So the 5 capitals framework is one that is frequently used to look at the livelihoods in relation to farming systems. So we've got natural capital, which is our land and water and that wider environment. We've got the infrastructure that we put on in relation to, for example, our farming systems, and the water that we can pull out through wells, the fencing, the buildings we put on, where we're located in terms of our access to market, which links into our social capital, the networks that we have. We have the people that work in our businesses, the skills and education that they bring, the knowledge that they have, their ability to actually do that work. And then we have the financial investment that we put in. So we need to bear in mind our whole system and our 5 capitals. And we have to manage certain risks, and these are what I call our sources of risk. So we have to manage the production, the technical side, frequently influenced by the climate and the weather. We then have to manage the marketing side, the economics, the global fluctuations in price. We have to manage that financial risk. Can we actually afford to do our business and pay off the debt? We have to look after our people, so we don't have accidents in the business. And a lot of that also then relates to the legal risk. So those are our sources that need to be managed, and those are the things that farmers think about. So one approach is you take the risk, but you try to mitigate it in some way. Another approach is not to take any risk at all, avoid risk altogether, but in a production system, in farming systems, avoiding risk altogether is not necessarily possible. So we have to do something just to reduce the level that we are exposed to. So this is how farmers are thinking in terms of, we've got the system, we've got our sources of risk. This is taken from a proposal presentation by an ex-master's student. In order to facilitate our future farming systems, we need to bring everyone along with us. And if we tweak things, and innovation is usually about tweaking rather than the new big thing. If we tweak things, we have innovations we want people to adopt. We have to bring them along with us. So there's a lot of research on innovation adoption. Part of it is the individual and what motivates them intrinsically. So we know that farmers are interested in looking after soil. They have that stewardship side of things. Extrinsically, we know that we are going to be motivated by, for example, the financial monies that we will receive for our particular products. If we're going to adopt something, we want to know, well, how does it work? What attributes does it have? How long will it take to see the implementation of something, whether it's a new system or a piece of technology or just the way we do something, how long will it take to show benefits? What are the social systems out there? What are other people doing? And I'll come on to that in a minute in terms of how that influences adoption. And then what are the communication channels? So there's a framework there in terms of our decision-making context that we need to bear in mind. And then another theory that is used is the theory of planned behaviour. And again, this was linked from a proposal presentation by an ex-PhD student. The theory of planned behaviour says if you want someone to do something, you have to have an understanding of their attitude. So do they believe this in this thing? And do they believe that if they adopt this thing, will the outcome be beneficial? The subjective norms, so who influences them? Who are the people? Is it their family? Is it their co-workers? Is it the vet, if it's looking at animal welfare? What are their beliefs around those? Who is important? And their ability, and how much influence do those important or not so important people have? And then the control that they have. So if they think this is a good thing, if everyone else thinks it's a good thing, do they actually have, for example, the money to actually implement it, or is it too costly to do so? Do they have the know-how to implement it, or do they need to bring someone in? If the attitude is positive, if the subjective norms are positive, but it's financially impossible to do for them, then it won't happen. So there's another theory there. So we have to have an understanding of that in the decision-making context. So this is another diagram from some previous work that I did in terms of how do we get to the implementation at the farm, at the final part. So we have before that the intention to implement. Yes, they want to do it. The perceived ability to implement. Can they actually afford to do it? What are their constraints in their farm business? And one of those could be inertia and current practice. What are the influences of others? And this particular example was looking at disease risk management. So I come from the UK where we had foot and mouth. Interestingly, a lot of things changed after that. I've seen Mycoplasma bovis here. There is a difference between people who've had Mycoplasma bovis on their farm. They've had previous experience compared to those who haven't had it, for example, just in terms of how people manage, for example, adopting something to do with managing their biosecurity. But this diagram explains a wider area than just disease risk management. What we found in this study, that was if you wanted to influence how people managed disease risk and biosecurity, and this was in the UK, it was the influence of the vets was pretty important. So if you targeted the vets, you could then get the implementation in the people. So that was one study. We also looked at the legislation coming from the EU in terms of animal health and hygiene and versus assurance. So you have people coming onto farm to look at, do the hygiene inspections, make sure that what's happening on farm, and we looked at this in relation to dairy farming, what's happening on farm in terms of the health, hygiene and quality would be unannounced. And then on the same day, you could essentially get someone from the assurance scheme coming on to look at your paperwork and check the same things. So we did a review of both the regulatory side plus the additional assurance side, talked to people, looked at the decisions they made, looked at the processes they undertook on farm as well as the people coming in. And now we have a system whereby if you're farm assured, you're not subject to all that legislative unannounced visits. So, and that's looking at the decision-making context and how people approached, how farmers approached the announced farm assurance scheme versus the unannounced animal health hygiene. And in this, so we have biosecurity, we have one which is access to markets, This is one in relation to wetlands, putting an environmental feature on farm. So we've got a drainage ditch, we've got a overland flow of soil sediment loss. If we can put edge of field wetlands in, is that beneficial? So we have a couple of examples in relation to ditch drainage, and this one slowing the flow down and allowing the sediment to go down. This work here actually led to an incentive scheme to pay farmers to actually, I'll say, put these on the farm. They didn't pay them fully for the cost, but it's provided grants towards. I'd also, in a previous study, looked at wetlands as, it was called Wetting Up Farms for Biodiversity, Birds and Biodiversity. And my colleagues called it Wetting Up Thistles, cleared areas, put little wetlands in. The idea was there'd be some nice vegetation, there'd be some insects, there'd be some birds, and you'd get nice habitat and biodiversity, and wouldn't that be really nice? It didn't necessarily achieve what it set out to achieve, but then in one case, we repurposed it into sort of the management of sedimentation loss, and it became part of policy where farmers then got incentives to manage loss of soil, but also could create a so-so habitat for biodiversity along the lines. So we got that into sort of environmental stewardship policy for England. This is in relation to soil erosion work, but I think it sums up the decision-making context of a lot of farmers, whatever you are talking about in relation to technology adoption, managing something for work-life balance, managing something for the environment. Certain things will be a last resort. Okay. Would only consider if a real issue. I mean, this one was in relation to erosion, but if it became a real issue, then people, anything, any subject you're thinking of, would only consider if it became a real issue. 2, could be part of the solution. Actually, I might think about doing something to do with that. To actually, well, I hadn't thought about it before, but I actually suspect that could be very effective. Well, not more paperwork and record keeping, going back to farmers like to be autonomous. So the decision-making context, what next? So this is an example of a paper written by colleagues of mine back in the UK, Philip Jones and Richard Tranter. And what they found was that farmers are subsidised for productive activity. If we remove that productive activity is the way in which the UK or England is heading, and subsidise environment, and then tell them what to do, there are less farmers likely to use that money for the environment. They're getting it anyway because they're subsidised and they sign up and they can cross-comply with stuff, and then they use it for environmental things where they're not interfered with by the regulation and the legislation. I do know one farmer who did, local to where I grew up as a kid, who used to buy ex-military equipment with his subsidy money, but he was a real outlier. So the idea that, okay, well, we'll transfer the money from here to here and farmers will opt in, was part of the work was actually, no, not all farmers will opt in, they'll just take a step back. Farmers are doing conservation work because they want to, not because they're told to do it, and not linked to legislation. This work is linked to Ashley, who was a BAG Sci Honours student a few years ago, and I think she presented, 2023 last year. So my co-supervisor Sharon is sitting there. And what this highlights is we looked at pastoral farmers, land use decisions. Ashley went out and did a lot of interviews and mapping, and what it came out with was that farmers weren't going to start, or had stopped thinking strategically, and were starting to think about, okay, I just need to concentrate on the financial, And if we had a bit of certainty around policy and practice, then I'd know what to do. But I'm just going to like wait and hold. And so there's a sort of stepping back from thinking strategically because they don't know what the political and market environment is going to bring next. And then this is currently unpublished. It's a paper I'm working on with a colleague, Percy, who also happens to be a rural valuation lecturer in my department, along with myself and Anita Rayford as his supervisors because he's doing his PhD. And we have, he was looking at property values in the Selwyn-Waihora area, and he interviewed a number of farmers. The different colours relate to which areas they were in, whether they were close to Lake Ellesmere, whether they were on clay or not, whether as a result of the implementation of environmental regulation, they'd made a positive change, no change or whatever, and whether they thought it would have an impact on their values. And the important point here was all doing what they had to do to remain compliant with the rules and the undercurrent. They're not going to do any more just yet, just in case something comes up that then they can go, oh, I can do that now. My next thing to meet the regulation, I can tick that box. If they do it in advance, are they then going to have to do something more because they were ahead of the game? So that's a concern. That's where my concern lies now. So we've got to think about, okay, so this is going on. Our farmers, where do they get information from? Their upbringing, who they know, usually their mates and peers and discussion groups. They might get, these days it's not paper copy, it comes in through their inbox, or most of them it comes in through their inbox. They might go to a field day, the levy boards are helpful, one-on-one consultants. These are the people that then go into extension, education, provide. Behind that there'll be some research, and we have the academics, the ivory tower. Those are the sources of information that we need to help push towards farmers in relation to innovation adoption, bearing in mind they're going, we're just going to do the minimal. Value of information. So these are ones I put up earlier, except for the supplier one. That tends to be a trigger. They might then think about, oh, we've seen something, we're interested to go to a field day, might talk to people about it, might go to the levy boards to take forward. Their suppliers that supply to them and their customers, the processors might also be helpful. Think of people like Sinlay who run their Lead with Pride scheme, for example. They make life easier. The bank has a governance role, and unfortunately the ivory tower, less of a role these days, which plan is to make that a bit better. What next? Immediate needs. Farmers focus on the operational, the compliance, the annual and seasonal requirements. We need to move from that into a more strategic decision-making process. In order to do that, farmers, rural professionals, everyone needs a bit of reassurance. There needs to be trust. There's a list of things here that are important for trust, but it's also about time and reputation, the time people spend and the reputation that people have to facilitate that particular change. From previous work I've done in New Zealand, looking at the advisory system, it needs to be simplified, it needs to be targeted. And the big issue I found is that we've got a lot going on in the operational space. We've got that press media, the internet, creating that awareness and interest, along with the levy bodies, feeding into the suppliers and agents, where farmers start to consider things, mates and peers get talked to. The vet comes in, I mentioned the vet previously, accountants might come in because you want to spend money. Bankers tend to sit out of the side of the system, on the governance side, on a more strategic side. There's not a lot going on in the strategic space because farmers are concentrating on that operational day-to-day. And for the future sustainable farming system, we need to change that. I will caveat that with yeah, we want to try something new today, but we must remember we've got some decent farming systems going on, and it might not be chucking out the old and bringing in the new. There might be stuff out there already we're already doing very well, can be implemented elsewhere, and just needs a slight tweak, and it needs partnerships. And I leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and ample opportunity for questions. Just please, as you come forward with questions, if you would just like to state your name, that would be really helpful. Please.
Ben Smith, Meridian Energy, Farms and Sustainability. Very interesting presentation, but having been directly involved in the Integrated Copper Harbour Management Group, setting that up, doing 1.6 million trees planted in the 10-year program, I just noticed that a lot of your academic referral was UK based and didn't include the influence that we've noticed for the Doc Fonterra partnerships, all that sort of stuff in the Matarangi Māori, all the AUT papers that were sponsored through it. Why are we missing that linkage into the Māori world of thinking when society and government and all our legislative process have honoured that within these type of presentations of farm management?
So why are we missing it? That is a good question. Hopefully, if I get funding for my next project, I'm bringing in our ex-Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Maori and Pacifica, plus early career Maori researchers to actually explore a bit more why it's not happening. I've been here 8 years. I wouldn't consider myself well embedded in fully understanding that system and bringing that in.
And the reason I ask it, I just want to quantify it. You know, look, 8th generation European New Zealander here, and of Waikato, you know, Ngāi Tahu, Ngāpuhi descent as well. And I just find it quite linear in terms of, and you know, we got 300 million into that project, but we missed out on the specialist land-based, you know, skills that Grant demonstrated the other day. You know, that Lincoln Holt, because of the non-involvement of the student body, and so that was the reason for my question. Because you know, we spent, you know, in that project, we spent 55 million on research papers, but none of them are reflected on a land-based.
I mean, in parts of the two here. I mean, this was a student in here in Cambodia, and it is about those motivations and understanding people's motivations. And we do have, I find this quite difficult, we do have that sort of Maori Pākehā disconnect still embedded in the rural sector. And, you know, we're trying to bridge that, but in order to get change, you need to bring people along, and there are intrinsic motivations that we probably need to change.
Another question.
Sorry for the detail.
No.
Alison, thank you very much. Juxtaposition of two things. The recent farmer rallies in Europe, rebelling somewhat against the cap or its current direction of trajectory, but there was also an open letter by a series of agricultural scientists pointing out that we've been, or in the EU in particular, the legislation has been pushing farmers to address environmental challenges, a very controlled system, but they've essentially been left to the open market in terms of getting a price and their income and stuff. So one end of their systems is being quite tightly controlled by legislation, whereas the other, they're at the mercy of the free market.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that, please?
So historically, any environmental consideration was driven by regulation, and the European Union has directives which specify outcomes, and it's up to you how you do it. And a bit like nitrate leaching in New Zealand used to be, and then regulations specify this is what we want and this is the way you're going to go about it. For certain things, regulation and legislation works. For certain things, the European Union probably started with a right pack. For certain other things, here's my economist hat comment, the market should dictate. If we want certain things, then people have got to pay for it, basically. From the juxtaposition of forcing people to do things and incentivizing people to do things, in some cases you will have to force people to do things.
Yeah. I have a question. You and I have both been to universities in the UK,
Yeah.
both taught universities in the UK, and probably seen the demise of agriculture in the UK,
Yeah.
and how it actually greatly impacted on the number of students studying in universities, including I was at a university which, once I left the UK, actually got shut down. Okay. What is the secret to, in your belief, to actually get more students to study ag at universities? And it's quite a deep question, because you've experienced probably the demise of ag teaching in the United Kingdom, just as I did. So what is the secret to that, do you believe, the core components of that?
So if we take somewhere like the UK, then it's a developed country with a lot of people in an environment. New Zealand, again, is a developed country, but is somewhat unique in that, because we're so far away from anywhere, we have managed to create an export market of our food and raw products. And I can't see rescuing the UK ag universities. They will still be required, and they probably need to be consolidated. So there is a critical mass of brain power. Lincoln has that critical mass of brain power, we're just not getting it out there. And I do think it's about educating. We say our schools, I would go earlier than our schools, about the industry that we actually work in, because I had an application from a student back in the UK, and we had something used called the University College Admission System, UCAS. So the student would put on their application which universities they wanted to go to. We'd only see the one that was us. Then they'd have a statement why they wanted to study, and then they'd have a statement from their school teacher, and the school teacher said, he drives a tractor occasionally, so he'll be ideal for this degree. And I thought, they have no understanding of the curriculum. So I think it's not about us educating students, it's about us educating the wider population about the importance of the food and fibre sector. And it's not just about being on the farm and sowing seeds and raising livestock. It's a wider education, and we have some good things going on. So our farm, St Peter's School, they had a demo, an open day recently. Interestingly, the most people that stopped for the open day were people who were driving past and saw the signs outside, and they spent a fortune on their radio ad, and no one put down, oh, I heard the radio ad, that's why the signs are. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jim, that's one last question.
Thanks, Alison. Nice talk. Farms are businesses.
Indeed.
And I think that in New Zealand, we're talking about change. Often we're talking about economics.
Yeah.
The farmers are obviously very concerned and interested in the environment and looking after the environment. To get down to brass tacks, and without strong regulation around environment, perhaps the economics of the business is king.
Yeah.
Would you say that the situation is the same for the UK and Europe?
Yeah, if you're not a viable business, then you're not viable. One thing I didn't say, the data which showed those dairy farmers were interested in looking after their employees. In the pilot study, what was interesting was we did share milkers, contract milkers, owner operators, and managers. So we had the contractor, the manager, the share milkers, the owner operators. And what we found was the share milkers, managers were, right, we've got to be financially viable. And then once we're financially viable, then we can start thinking about, my own work-life balance and my family. And the manager was concerned about his employees, but less concerned about his own work-life balance and viability. And then we'll start thinking about, when we get further down the asset ownership, then we can start thinking about the environment. So it's, this was discussions about sustainability without using the word sustainability. And it was, we need to be viable. And then when we're viable, then we can think about the other things. But they were thinking about the other things as well, just as long as they weren't costly. And as long as they could go, actually, if I do that, that has benefits long term for this, which keeps me viable. So it's the things that are going to affect their business and the financial viability of the business that needs careful consideration in the way we go forward. Going back to my comment, if we as a society want that, and if we as a society need that, then we need to be paying for it, or the general public need to be paying for it. We need to be paying for the systems that keep us viable, or paying for the systems to keep us viable, but also environmentally beneficial and socially acceptable.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for joining us here this evening with Alison for her presentation and excellent series. Just a small token here of appreciation today. We have for drinks and so. Thank you.